Hello and welcome to Abnormal Psychology. This is going to be a brief overview of Chapter 1, Overview to Understanding Abnormal Psychology by Susan Krauss Whitbourne, 9th edition. So what is abnormal psychology? What would you think it is? What makes something abnormal? Is it non-typical or uncommon, socially unacceptable, meaning that it deviates from the norm? What about distressing to the person who exhibits it or those around them? Or maladaptive, meaning that the behavior limits the ability to function or fulfill life responsibilities. The social impact of psychological disorders affects both the individual and those in their circle. The stigma that's associated with it is a negative label that causes certain people to be regarded as different, defective, or set apart from the mainstream members of society. According to the National Institute of Mental Health in 2016, mental disorders are common in the United States and internationally. There's an estimated 18.5% of Americans aged 18 and older, about 1 in 5 adults, that suffer from a diagnosable mental disorder in a given year. When applied to the 2010 U.S. Census residential population, it estimates for ages 18 and older, this figure translates to 43.8 million people. Even though mental disorders are widespread in the population, the main burden of illness is concentrated in a much smaller proportion, about 6% or 1 in 25, who suffer from a serious mental illness. In addition, mental disorders are the leading cause of disability in the United States and Canada for ages 15 to 44. Many people suffer from more than one mental disorder at a given time. Nearly half, or 45% of those with a mental disorder, meet the criteria for 2 or more disorders, with severity strongly related to comorbidity. How do you think of these behaviors? Finding a lucky seat on an exam, unable to eat, sleep, or study for days after ending a relationship? Breaking into a cold sweat at the thought of being trapped in an elevator? Refusing to eat solid food for days to stay thin? Swearing, throwing pillows, and pounding fists on the wall in the middle of an argument with a roommate? Engaging in a thorough hand washing after coming home from a bike ride? Protesting the rising cost of college by joining a picket line outside the campus administration building? Being convinced that people are constantly being critical of everything we do? Drinking a 6-pack of beer a day in order to be sociable with friends? Or playing video games for hours at a time, avoiding other study work and obligations? What does constitute a psychological disorder? Abnormal behavior involves disturbance of psychological function or behavior. Psychological dysfunction is associated with distress or impairment that is not typically or culturally appropriate. Clinical significance. This means that the behavior includes a measurable degree of impairment that is observable by a clinician. The behavior must reflect a dysfunction in a psychological, biological, or developmental process. If researchers don't know the cause of the dysfunction, they assume it can be discovered in the future. Behavior must also be associated with significant distress or disability in important realms of life. It is based on how the person feels or behaves. If the person feels negatively affected by the behavior, this is distress. If they suffer negative life consequences as a result, it is considered a disability. Behavior can't be simply socially deviant as defined in terms of one's religion, politics, or sexuality. For example, someone who's vegan versus someone who completely restricts their food intake and puts their health in jeopardy is very different. And the final criterion to decide if something meets abnormal behavior criteria in a possible psychological disorder is that the psychological disorder reflects a dysfunction within the individual and not a difference in political beliefs across citizens or their governments. The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, which we're on the 5th edition, is a manual to help mental health professionals use these 5 criteria to guide them in assigning such diagnoses when appropriate. We will be learning more about the DSM-5 in Chapter 2. So what causes abnormal behavior? Biopsychosocial perspective states that biological, psychological, and sociological factors are seen as influencing the development of an individual. From this perspective, abnormal behavior is seen as reflecting a combination of these 3 as they evolve during a person's growth and development. The biological looks at the physiological influences such as body functioning, the nervous system, and genetics. Biological theories focus on the roles of the nervous system and genetics. Genetics, physical changes, environmental influences, illnesses, injuries, and environmental deprivation are all contributors to biological influences. In the biopsychosocial perspective, psychological causes are not viewed in isolation. They're part of a larger constellation of factors influenced by psychological alterations interacting with exposure to certain environments. This can include results from experiences such as repeat distressing behaviors that have been learned, expressing emotional instability as a result of feeling parents cannot be relied upon when you're a child. They reflect learning life experiences and/or exposure to key situations in life as reflecting predominantly psychological influences, which can include difficulty coping with stress, illogical fears, susceptibility to uncontrollable emotions, dysfunctional thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. And sociocultural contributions, they look at the various cycles of influence on the individual from close friends and families to institutions and policies of a country or the world as a whole. The influences interact with biological processes and with psychological contributions that occur through exposure to experience. Discrimination also limits people's ability to experience psychological well-being and can have a direct effect on physical health and development. Stigma of a psychological disorder vary by ethnicity and race. For instance, European American adolescents and their caregivers are twice as likely as minority groups to define problems in mental health terms or seek help. In addition, those who are younger and female are more open to the experience of symptoms and more willing to participate in treatment. Disturbances in any of the three areas of human functioning can contribute to the development of a psychological disorder. There are many possible interactions between these three. The degree of influence varies by disorder. You can also add the developmental aspect on how influences change over time. For example, there's protective factors when someone's pregnant, there's early risk factors when we're young, and physical health changes due to our poor dietary habits and other poor habits that can accumulate over time as we age. So now we're going to look at some prominent theories in abnormal psychology. The first is the spiritual approach. This is a prehistoric to about 1693 BC. There has been archaeological evidence that supports the acceptance of the spiritual approach during this time frame. One of the approaches used was triphoning to be able to treat people that had abnormal behavior as defined at the time. And what they did is they drilled holes into people's skulls to release evil spirits. And this practice has been found as far as the Far and Middle East, all the way to Britain and South America. Other types of treatment were exorcism, where a shaman or priest put the person under extreme physical or mental duress in an effort to drive out devils. And during the Middle Ages, people with psychological disorders were labeled sinners, witches, or personifications of the devil. They were severely punished with deportation, torture, and burning at the stake. Next is the humanitarian approach. As a reaction to the spiritual approach, the humanitarian approach started in the Middle Ages. There were poorhouses and monasteries in Europe that were established to shelter people with psychological disorders. Unfortunately, they became overcrowded and conditions grew intolerable, and they became places of neglect, abuse, and maltreatment. The belief became that the psychologically disturbed lacked ordinary senses or sensory capabilities, which led to not providing them proper heating, clean living conditions, or appropriate food. Treatments included bleeding, forced vomiting, and purging. By the end of the 18th century, people began to recognize the inhumane treatment of people in the hospitals in France, Scotland, and England. And the moral treatment reform began with the belief that people could develop self-control over their behaviors if they had a quiet and restful environment. Restraints were only to be used as absolutely necessary. In the early 1800s, the conditions began to worsen again due to overcrowding and increased use of physical punishment as a means to control people's behavior. In 1841, Dorothea Dix, a Boston school teacher, appealed to the Massachusetts legislature for more state-funded public hospitals to provide human treatment for mental patients. She then spread her message throughout North America and Europe. Over the next 100 years, governments built more state hospitals as the humanitarian model originally advocated. However, it did not take long for the hospitals to become overcrowded and understaffed. It was not possible to cure people as proposed by the moral treatment movement. In 1963, the federal government passed the Mental Retardation Facilities and Community Mental Health Center Construction Act, initiating a series of changes that would affect mental health services for future decades. There was a push to move people out of institutions and into less restrictive programs in the community. Such programs as vocational rehab centers, day hospitals, psychiatric clinics were all developed. After discharge, patients were relocated to halfway houses. These halfway houses were community treatment facilities designed for these deinstitutionalized clients that were leaving the hospital but not ready for independent living. This act released hundreds of thousands of patients from hospitals in the 1960s. The increase in the pharmacological treatments that began in the 1950s also helped to pave the way for deinstitutionalization and the successful control of psychological disorder symptoms. Unfortunately, due to inadequate planning and insufficient funding, once again it backfired, and patients cycled through shelters, rehabs, jails, prisons, and being homeless. There are groups today such as NAMI, the National Alliance for the Mentally Ill, and the Mental Health Association, the Center to Address Discrimination and Stigma, and the Eliminate the Barriers Initiative that are involved in promoting mental health consumers and to take an active role in the choosing of their treatment. At the end of 2017, the President's New Freedom Commission was reported to have made progress improving the delivery of mental health services. I can tell you from personal experience that in the 1990s, once again, there was a push to remove psychiatric patients from state hospitals. I witnessed elderly psychiatric patients be removed from the Kerrville State Hospital and placed in psychiatric hospitals awaiting placement out in the community. Unfortunately, these individuals had lived in the state facility for so long that it was their home. They did not understand why they were being removed, and the removal from their home exacerbated their symptoms. 3 of the stories that I distinctly remember are one lady who wanted badly to go to a specific nursing facility, and we put her in there, and she was not happy, and she did not live for many years after that. Another lady became so paranoid, and she was placed into a group home, but it was very difficult for her. And the worst story was a lady who was put into a more independent type living situation where she had an apartment that she shared with another person. She immediately returned to the streets and became homeless. So even though these approaches sound wonderful in theory, they don't always mean what's best for the patient. So that's something to keep in mind. Next is the scientific approach, which spans back to ancient times of Hippocrates, so 460 to 377 BC. Hippocrates was the founder of modern medicine, and he believed 4 bodily fluids influence physical and mental health, which led to 4 personality dispositions. He believed that to treat psychological disorders required ridding the body of the appropriate excess fluid. Even though he was incorrect, he was far ahead in recognizing mental health reflected factors in the body rather than evil spirits. From 130 to 200 AD, Roman physician Claudius Galen developed a system of medical knowledge based on anatomical studies used to advance the position that diseases had their source in abnormal bodily function. Then the scientific approach receded for about 100 years in favor of the spiritual perspective. In 1745 to 113 AD, Dr. Benjamin Rush, founder of American psychiatry, appalled by poor treatment of the psychological disturbed in the Pennsylvania hospital system, advocated for improvements such as wards for patients by themselves, separate from other patients, occupational therapy, and not allowing curiosity-seeking tours for people's entertainment. However, Rush did support bloodletting, purging, and the so-called tranquilizer chair, which was designed to reduce blood flow to the brain by binding the patient's heads and limbs. In addition, he submerged patients in cold water to frighten them with death threats, hoping to induce fear to curb their violent behaviors. In 1844, the Association of Medical Superintendents of American Institutions for the Insane, which later became the American Psychiatric Association, was developed. In 1845, Wilhelm Geisinger proposed neuropathologies were the cause of psychological disorders. And in 1856 to 1926, Emil Kraepelin promoted a classification system to identify patterns of symptoms. This was an early basis of the DSM. While this was taking place in the 1800s, the roots of a psychological approach to abnormality began to emerge with the Viennese neurologist Sigmund Freud from 1856 to about 1939. He developed psychoanalysis that relied on the concepts of the unconscious mind, inhibited sexual impulses in early development. From 1849 to 1936, the Russian physiologist Ivan Pavlov discovered classical conditioning and became the basis for the behaviorist movement that began in the United States by John B. Watson in 1878 to 1958. From 1904 to 1990, B.F. Skinner formulated the systematic approach to operant conditioning, specifying the types and nature of reinforcement and its use to modify behavior. In the 20th century, behaviorism morphed into social learning theory of Albert Bandura in 1925. In 1921, the cognitive model of Aaron Beck, and from 1913 to 2007, the rational motive therapy of Albert Ellis. It also morphed into the current positive psychology movement that emphasizes the potential growth and change throughout life. So now let's look at some research methods in abnormal psychology. The process of testing ideas about the nature of psychological phenomenon without bias before accepting these ideas is adequate explanations. The scientific method involves a progression of steps from posing questions of interest to sharing the results with the scientific community. The process can be conducted with a variety of descriptive and experimental research designs. The independent variable is the variable that is adjusted or controlled or manipulated in some manner in the study by the experimenter. A dependent variable is the variable that's being measured to see how it changes as of the result of the manipulation of that independent variable. There are different research experiment designs. So research in which researchers randomly assign participants to conditions in which they receive different forms of treatment, and it minimizes the chances that bias can enter into the decision of which participants receive which treatment. And it's used as the foundation of evidence-based treatment in which clients receive interventions based on the findings of controlled clinical studies. So if you think about a study and you're going to be studying the effects of a medication, how could the results be impacted if the researcher themselves or the participants themselves knew if they were getting the medication or if they were getting a placebo, which appears to be the medication, but it does not have the same impact. So the placebo condition I just mentioned, you receive a treatment that is similar to the experimental treatment, but it's not it. A placebo-controlled randomized clinical trials where the experimental method in which the participants are randomly assigned to a placebo versus a treatment group. And then double-blind method is neither the person giving the treatment nor the person receiving it knows whether they have received the experimental or been assigned to the control group. So they don't know if they're getting the medication or if they're getting the placebo. And then quasi-experimental is to investigate the differences among groups not created by random assignment. So it is not random. I can give you a quick personal experience. I was involved in a sleep study for narcolepsy, and it was a double-blind study, which meant that neither I nor my doctor, who was the experimenter in this case, knew which group I was in. Neither one of us knew if I was receiving the medication or if I was receiving a placebo. And usually it is several years after the study has concluded and been published where they even let you know which group that you were in. Another design is the correlational design. It involves the test of relationships between variables that researchers cannot experimentally manipulate. The statistic used in correlational studies is a number expressed in decimals between +1 and -1. Positive numbers represent a positive correlation, meaning that the score as one variable increases, the score on the second variable increases. Negative numbers represent inverse relationships, meaning that as one variable increases, the numbers of the other decreases in a similar extent. The number itself must be presented along with an indication of its statistical significance, meaning that based on the number of participants in the research, among other factors, the relationship has a low probability of occurring due to chance. A correlation does not equal causality. Just because as people's age increases, the number of car accidents decreases, does not mean that increased age causes less car accidents. There may be a correlation, but it does not signify causality. Here is a chart with some different types of methods that can be used. A survey, if you want to just obtain like data from the population, kind of like census data. Laboratory study, this is where you really need to control the variables and have control over what could be intervening in your study. A case study is either an individual or a small group of people that is studied intensely, and that story is told in the research. A single case experimental design is where the same person serves as the subject in the experimental, meaning they're getting the treatment, and the control condition, meaning they're not getting the treatment. And I'll show you a sample in just a second. Behavioral genetics is an attempt to identify genetic patterns of inheritance of particular behaviors. So incidence is the frequency of new cases within a given time period, and prevalence is the number of people who have ever had a disorder at a given time or over a specific time period. Qualitative research is a method of analyzing data in which researchers use rigorous methods to code the data and summarize information in a way that reflects an objectively applied set of standards. It is telling the story. It is not like your experimental research in which I'm going to manipulate variable A to see what happens to variable B. For instance, if you wanted to observe a specific culture of people, they may not answer a specific way on a survey, or if you're observing them in a certain manner, they may change their behavior. But by using qualitative research in which you immerse yourself, or you're able to observe in a manner that does not interfere with their way of life, you could then gather real life data and tell the story of whatever it is that you are studying about that particular culture. There's also research in behavioral genetics that's focused on identifying the role of hereditary factors in psychological disorders. Concordance rate is the agreement ratios between people diagnosed as having a particular disorder and their relatives. Cross-fostering is an adoption study in which researchers examine frequency of the disorder in children whose biological parents had no disorder, but whose adoptive parents do. Gene mapping is an approach used by biological researchers in which they examine variations in chromosomes and connect them to performance on psychological tests or diagnosis of specific disorders. And molecular genetics is the study of how genes translate hereditary information. This is a single case experimental design, or SCED, also known as ABAB for alternating between conditions A and B design. The same person, if you look at the charts at the top, the same person serves as the subject in both the experimental and the control conditions. A single subject design typically alternates between the baseline condition, which is signified with A in the top chart, and intervention, which is the treatment, in B in the top chart. This is an example of a SCED study studying the self-injurious behaviors. So you've got that the same person is getting no treatment, they're getting treatment. No treatment, they're getting treatment. And then in the ABA design at the bottom, the researcher will observe behaviors in phase A, then they give them a treatment in phase B, then they remove that treatment, observe behaviors again, and then give treatment again. So as you can see here, there was a difference when they received treatments in this study, but not in this one at the bottom. I hope this was helpful. Thank you very much and have a wonderful day.